start with 146, the Seagram Building. This is New York City, U.S., obviously. Ludwig Mies van der Rohe and Philip Johnson were the two architects. And this is 1945 to 1958. Steel frame with glass curtain wall and bronze. Now, we looked first at one of the first skyscrapers that was only just about 40 years before this. So a lot is happening. There's a lot of movement and mentality to create these giant buildings, especially in cities like Chicago and New York, where there's not a lot of land. The only way you can build is up. So that's what architects started to do. And this is a big example of how steel frame began to make architects be able to build much higher stories than they had been before. With reinforced concrete, you can only go so high, but with steel frame, you're allowed to go a lot higher. Okay. This is called the Seagram Building, and the two architects are renowned architects in, if you look at an architecture field, they are two pioneers that really made more modern architecture, put it on the map. Okay. Mies van der Rohe made skyscrapers in pre and post World War II. Okay. He immigrated to the U.S. in 1937, and his goal in architecture is really form. Okay, so he is really concerned with the form of architecture. He created kind of almost like a drapery in organic form with his use of glass, which for the time was very profound. Okay, and he's very rational, orthogonal, monolithic. He used crystallizations of their inner structure. So almost crystallizations of their inner structure you can see through the use of windows, and how you can see into everything. The form is directly, as before, following function. This is an office structure building, and it is created to house that. So this is in 1945, 1958, and this is really in the shadow of World War II. And during this time period, people were kind of devoted to a newer and more exciting technology. Okay, people wanted to move on. People wanted to develop new and different things. In the modern era, later skyscrapers with ornamental steel beams is more indicative of the experience of modernity. Okay. Modernity is which one experienced in the city through rapid movements like the automobile. But this piece is it's very vertical. So if you look at it, it's very vertical, almost like a bird cage with many vertical lines, but it's very rational, ordered, logical, and really considered to be focusing with form and structure. Okay, so Mies van der Rohe and Philip Johnson were two of these main architects who also emphasized on this international style, which was architecture since 1922. And they basically toned down the progressive social ethos that embodied in the very projects they selected, and they really focused more on the emphasis of volume rather than mass, making it higher rather than wider, regularity rather than symmetry. So it might not be completely symmetrical, but there's a regularity to it, and the avoidance of applied decoration. So there's, like we saw in the earlier building that we looked at, the Sullivan project, there was a decorative ornate pieces around the bottom where you would enter into the retail portion of the skyscraper. And this portion you can really see is void of any type of architectural decoration. Okay. Now, if you look at the very bottom, you'll notice the pillars that are there. That's very reminiscent in Le Corbusier's piece that we just looked at, Villa Savoy, and how that kind of, it's almost like it's standing on little legs. Okay. And using again that type of pillar for the actual piece. Basically, what they wanted to do is create these principles that were reduced to the social breadth of modernism in Europe to a style. So there's this whole movement of modernism going on in the world, and with the conclusion of World War II, and so there's a lot of different things. So you can see down at the bottom where the pillars are. There's also stairs that lead up to the building. Okay, almost kind of Greek-ish with the pillars and the stairs going up, almost like it's some sort of temple, but almost like a modern temple. Bronze-clad building, very Greek symmetrical pillars. They look like fluted columns up on a platform, very classical in structure. Modern architecture balances the old and the new. It's a decorative simpleton, so it doesn't really have any decorative elements, but it's still decorative in the way it is created. This was actually the most expensive building at this time, so there had never been another building created that was more expensive than this building. Mies van der Rohe constantly refers to antiquity within his work, so again relating to that Greek and that Roman type of architecture. And there's a public space below where the stairs are, and there's also reflecting pools, so it kind of is more of a gathering space for people outside of the building. The next piece that we're going to be looking at is 149, The Bay by Helen Frankenthaler, 1963, acrylic on canvas. And so we can see that the world is starting to get a little bit more abstract. We see an imposing fluid blue promontory suspended in front of us. Its colors, ranging from violet to indigo, run into another with a clear zone of navy near the top of the canvas that draws our eyes up to it. The blurring of the colors gives an immediate sense of the artist's process. The paint poured onto the canvas when it was wet. We can almost watch as the blues meld into one another during this early stage, giving the image its blurred and smooth finish. Is its subject what the title suggests, a landform of some kind with a certain emblematic associations? It is the swelling, amorphous blue mass floating amid that moss green and cream border meant to stand for something beyond itself. With many abstract expressionists paintings of the 1950s and 60s, it's important not to get too caught up with possible social and historical contexts and biography, but to focus on what's before us, the physical elements of the work itself, because those elements can tell us so much about the actual painting. When Helen Frankenthaler painted The Bay, she was already a well-regarded artist. She'd been the subject of a Life magazine profile in 1956 and was one of the handful of women among the traditional all-boys club in the New York abstract expressionists. The Bay was chosen as one of the paintings for an American pavilion of the 1966 Venice Biennial. Looking closely, you can see that the shades of blues that run into one another are part of a specific process of pouring paint onto the canvas, rather than painting the colors onto the surface with a brush, as the leading abstract expressionist painters like Jackson Pollock, William de Kooning, and Franz Kline were so famous for doing. Frankenthaler's approach here was to use a soap stain method with diluted acrylic paint. Acrylics gave her more flexibility with viscosity and movements than oils did, and it allowed her to have more control as she poured that thinned paint onto the taut, unprimed canvas so that it would get absorbed into the weave of the fabric. As a substitute for the action of the brush, Frankenthaler would lift the canvas and tilt it at various angles so that the paint would flow across the surface. She had to account for gravity and the ebb and flow of a liquid across a flat surface. So a fascinating aspect of Frankenthaler's method is the blend of the artist's control paired with the unpredictability of the forces of nature. This kind of painting is often classified as color field painting. Painting characterized by simplicity of line and a focus on color as the subject rather than as an add-on. The color is the subject. The first generation of abstract expressionists like Mark Rothko and Barnett Newman were the first important color field painters, while Helen Frankenthaler is often classified as a second generation member of the group. Frankenthaler was inspired by the drip method of Jackson Pollock, who began painting on the floor in the late 1940s. But she knew she wanted to work differently. Pollock and other artists such as de Kooning and Franz Kline had made the painting gesture too famous and recognizable by the early 1950s. So, in 1952, at the age of 23, Frankenthaler's experiments led her to produce her first major painting, Mountains and Sea, which was an expansive, luminous depiction of the landscape of Nova Scotia, where she'd recently taken a holiday. The same year she painted the bay, Frankenthaler painted a series of similar soak-stained paintings with titles referring to water and geography: canal, low tide, blue tide, inspired by the landscape of her country home in Providence, Massachusetts, Provincetown. As Frankenthaler said, it's important for us not to be too encumbered by context and speculation when we look at her work. We are to take from it what we will in our own terms. All right, 150. I'm just cruising today. Okay, 150. Lipstick. Ascending on Caterpillar Tracks. Claes Oldenburg, 1969 to 1974. Core 10 steel, aluminum, and cast resin, painted with polyurethane enamel. I love this piece. It's one of those pieces, I know I say that all the time, but it's one of those pieces that is a direct protest for the movements in Vietnam War. Okay, and so we're going to look at like how that relates to the Vietnam War, but this was in direct correlation to the creation of that. Claes Oldenburg does a lot of giant sculpture work, which could be considered pop art. We're going to go forward. So these are some of Claes Oldenburg's pieces, and there are a lot of pieces that are cloth, they are plastic, they are created with different things, but he takes it's more pop art because he takes everyday objects and kind of makes them puts them in different types of situations. So if you look at the bottom right hand corner, you have this giant spoon with a cherry on top, and you can see the little kids underneath it. Giant, okay? It's like a bridge. You have this giant ice cream cone that's like face down on the side of a building. You have a giant gardening tool on the left-hand side. You have a old-fashioned ice pack in the middle. I actually saw that one at the Seattle Art Museum for a pop art exhibit, and it rotates. So it actually is on like a little mechanism where it will rotate and expand, and then it'll rotate and then it'll go back down. So you kind of watch it move. And then you have the clothespin and then the caterpillar tracks. Okay, so we're going to go back to this idea of the caterpillar tracks and look at what it is. So Claes Oldenburg, with his saggy hamburgers, colossal clothespins, and giant three-way plugs, Claes Oldenburg has been the reigning king of pop sculpture since the early 1960s. He is still working today, by the way. We have some of his work in right outside of the old EMP, which is now the Apah, I think, Museum of Modern Pop Culture. I don't remember what it's called now, but it used to be the old EMP, right by Memorial Field, football field, and there's one of Claes Oldenburg's sculptures actually right there. So Claes Oldenburg has been the reigning king of pop sculpture since the 1960s, back when New York was still truly gritty. In 1961, he rented a storefront, called it The Store, and stocked it with stuffed, crudely painted forms resembling diner food, cheap clothing, and other mass-manufactured items that stupefied an audience accustomed to the austere, non-representational forms in abstract expressionist sculpture. These so-called soft sculptures are now hailed as the first sculptural expressions in pop art. While his work had continued to grow in scale and ambition, his focus has really remained steadfast. Everyday items are presented on a magnified scale that reverse the traditional relationship between viewer and object. So he's really trying to get you to challenge your notion of a difference between the viewer and the object, and he's changing that relationship, that role between those things by what he is creating. Oldenburg shrinks the spectator into a bite-sized morsel that might be devoured along with a giant piece of cake or crushed by an enormous ice pack. His work shows us how small we are and serves as a vehicle for his smart, witty, critical, and often wickedly funny insights on American culture over the past half century. Whereas pop artists had imitated the flat language of billboards, magazines, television, things like that, working in two-dimensional mediums, Oldenburg's three-dimensional paper maches, plaster molds, and soft fabric forms brought pop art into the realm of sculpture, a key innovation at the time. Oldenburg's objects, no matter how apparently insignificant in themselves, become expressive entities, almost like characters in a stage play. This is partly due to their dramatic, outsized scale, and partially due to the soft forms that he actually chooses, like fabrics or latex. This distances Oldenburg from the cool detachment of Warhol or Lichtenstein and makes his sculptures almost like portraits, highlight the absurdity of American culture with a gentler cynicism than his pop art peers. The notion of enlarging a diminutive, everyday object and placing it in a landscape, an idea integral to Oldenburg's monumental public art, comes to us from the surrealists such as Marguerite, Dali, and Ernst. In this respect, Oldenburg is the most surreal of the pop arts, and his sculptures are like surrealist dreams made real. Oldenburg's unconventionally squishy, rearrangeable sculpture challenged the hard vertical orientation that persisted through abstract expressionism. His was a true breakthrough in the history of sculpture. No matter how ordinary his subjects may seem to be, for Oldenburg, a clothespin is never just a clothespin. The process of fine-tuning and adjustment, typical of his approach to large-scale commissions, reflects an unwavering interest in the impact of forms that aligns him with earlier masters in the tradition of sculpture, from Michelangelo to Brancusi. Unlike most of his pop art peers, Oldenburg's work conveyed an unambiguously anti-war message at the height of the U.S. military intervention in Vietnam. So this is specifically talking about the Caterpillar tracks. Okay. So this is an anti-war message at the height of the U.S. military intervention in Vietnam. An alumnus of Yale, Oldenburg mobilized a group of students to assist him in creating a mixed media anti-war monument in 1969, and initially installing it in the Beinecke Plaza on campus at Yale. In the original version, the lipstick was capped with a flimsy fabric peak that required the activation of a mechanical pump to inflate it and rose over 20 feet in the air from the plywood base. Fashioned in the shape of an army tank, which functioned as a speaker platform, so people could speak out against the war. The double reference to female excitement and male impotence was designed to call attention to the absurdity of the U.S. military aggression and served as a rallying point for the fierce, impassioned anti-war demonstrations of that year. It was removed ostensibly from the purposes of structural for the purposes of structural maintenance, and later repaired for replaced with the painted metal version shown here of the lipstick. The reinstalled on campus outside the Morris College building, the first public artwork installed by the artist. It worked to solidify his alignment with the peace movement and shaped his goals for larger future commissions. So again, here's the pieces, and we're going to go look back at his piece first here. So we have the caterpillar tracks, and so it was kind of this piece would actually like inflate and deflate. The lipstick would on the original, because that was cloth, and so it was kind of showing female excitement, but also male impotence, meaning that it wasn't growing, it was shrinking. And it was just kind of this passive protest to how they believed people were approaching the Vietnam War. So a lot of anti-war rallies, protests, speeches, and things like that happened on the platform of this specific piece when it was first put up in 1969 at Yale.